early 1970s, the Soviet KGB closely monitored Syrian President Hafez al-Assad's every move, especially during his visits to Moscow. The Soviets were eager for Assad to sign a friendship treaty, hoping to solidify Syria as a loyal ally. However, Assad was wary of appearing as a Soviet client, even as he sought advanced weaponry. Tensions peaked in July 1972, when Assad, frustrated by Brezhnev's pressure, nearly left Moscow abruptly. Only a personal visit from Brezhnev, promising to drop the treaty issue, convinced Assad to stay. This delicate dance between alliance and autonomy would define Soviet-Syrian relations for years to come. During Assad's Moscow visit, Brezhnev admitted that Egypt, despite a friendship treaty with the Soviets, had just expelled all Soviet advisors. This was a blow to Soviet prestige and a warning sign for their relationship with Syria. Assad, however, resisted similar pressure from Egypt's Sadat to expel Soviet advisors from Syria, publicly stating, "They are here for our own good." This public stance reassured Moscow, but Assad's reluctance to formalize ties through a treaty kept the Soviets on edge. The balance between dependence on Soviet arms and maintaining Syrian independence was a constant theme in their interactions. Despite his reluctance to sign a friendship treaty, Assad made significant concessions to the Syrian Communist Party. In March 1972, the party was allowed to join the Ba'ath-dominated National Progressive Front, granting it de facto legality. The communists were also permitted to publish a newspaper, Nidal al-Shab. These moves strengthened the party's position, but also deepened internal divisions, especially between the longtime leader Khalid Bakdash and the rest of the Politburo, who resented his autocratic style and Moscow's support for Assad. Khalid Bakdash, the dogmatic leader of the Syrian Communist Party, faced mounting opposition from within his own ranks. While he was in Moscow for medical treatment in April 1972, his critics accused him of Stalinist methods and personality cult. The Soviet Union intervened, hosting both factions in Moscow to resolve their differences. Though Pravda reported a warm, friendly atmosphere, the reality was a fragile truce. Bakdash managed to outmaneuver his opponents, reaffirming his loyalty to both Moscow and Assad, but the internal rift continued to complicate Soviet policy in Syria. KGB's most successful operation in Syria involved the penetration of the Syrian embassy in Moscow. The Soviets bugged offices, intercepted diplomatic bags, and even opened personal letters marked most secret. Their meticulous attention to detail ensured that tampering went undetected. The files reveal the codenames of 34 agents and contacts, mostly Soviet citizens, used in these operations. The KGB's methods mirrored those used against other embassies, focusing on both official correspondence and personal vulnerabilities of diplomats. KGB's penetration of the Syrian embassy was extensive. Agents reported on the personalities and opinions of diplomats, sometimes including trivial details like the ambassador's plans to send a piano home. Soviet female employees were tasked with assessing the vulnerability of Syrian diplomats to sexual seduction, and currency exchanges on the black market were used as leverage. The KGB even organized elaborate hunting expeditions to distract diplomats during special operations and to encourage confidential conversations. During a hunting expedition in September 1973, the Syrian ambassador confided to a KGB officer that Arab states had no hope of destroying Israel soon, but would try to shatter its image of invincibility. The KGB later concluded that the ambassador had advanced knowledge of the Yom Kippur War, which broke out less than a month later. This intelligence coup highlighted the depth of Soviet penetration and the complex interplay of trust and manipulation between the KGB and its Syrian contacts. After the Yom Kippur War, Assad was dissatisfied with Soviet-supplied MiG-19s and MiG-21s, and angered by Moscow's refusal to provide the more advanced MiG-23. His displeasure was evident when he withheld congratulations on the October Revolution. Despite a visit from Air Marshal Pokrishkin in 1974, tensions remained. However, Sadat's pivot to the US made Moscow eager to mend ties, resulting in massive arms shipments to Syria, including MiG-23s, tanks and missiles, and the deployment of thousands of Soviet advisors. In 1975, the KGB sought to recruit Syrian Communist Party members for covert operations in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Bakdash and his associate FAID were tasked with finding candidates who were loyal, experienced in clandestine work, and capable of blending in abroad. The criteria were strict. Candidates had to be disciplined, resourceful, and preferably unmarried, with technical skills needed in target countries. This reaffirmed Bakdash's special relationship with Moscow, even as internal party tensions simmered. In 1976, Brezhnev publicly declared Syria the Soviet Union's closest Middle Eastern ally. Yet behind the scenes, the KGB was planting forgeries to stoke Assad's suspicions of Sadat and the US. One such forgery claimed that Sadat's break with the Soviets was orchestrated by Washington. These active measures were designed to reinforce Assad's reliance on Moscow, even as public celebrations of Soviet-Syrian friendship were marred by Syria's intervention in Lebanon and subsequent Soviet criticism. Syria's intervention in the Lebanese civil war in 1976, siding with Maronite Christians against leftist and PLO forces, shocked Moscow. The Soviet press accused Syria of betraying the Palestinian cause, and the KGB secretly funded the Lebanese Communist Party, which opposed Syrian intervention. Arms supplies to Syria were cut, and Assad retaliated by expelling Soviet advisors and removing Soviet naval assets from Tartus. However, as Syrian involvement in Lebanon waned, relations with Moscow gradually improved. After the assassination of Lebanese leader Kamal Jumblat in 1977, Assad sought to repair relations with the Soviet Union. His visit to Moscow was met with a warm welcome from Brezhnev, and he declared that Soviet-Syrian relations had overcome all difficulties. Soviet arms exports to Syria soared, exceeding $1 billion in 1978. This renewed partnership was driven by mutual opposition to Sadat's peace overtures with Israel and the Camp David Accords. Assad's hostility to Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and the Camp David Agreement led to secret meetings with Palestinian factions. In December 1977, Assad authorized a meeting in Damascus with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine to discuss plans for assassinating Sadat. These covert operations underscored the high stakes and deep mistrust that characterized Middle Eastern politics during this era. In the late 1970s, the Soviets again tried to push Assad into signing a friendship treaty and even proposed a trilateral pact with Iraq. Syrian officials bristled at these demands, especially suggestions to station Syrian MiGs in Iraq. The resulting diplomatic spat saw the Syrian ambassador recalled from Moscow. Yet, shared opposition to Camp David and Israeli actions in Lebanon soon brought the two sides back together. Encouraged by KGB disinformation, Assad became convinced that the Camp David agreements were part of a vast US-Israeli conspiracy. In 1980, he publicly accused the CIA of plotting to subjugate the Arab world. His defense minister even claimed that only Assad's leadership prevented the creation of a greater Israel, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. These beliefs fueled Syria's continued reliance on Soviet support. In 1980, Assad finally signed a 20-year treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. That year, Syrian arms imports from the Soviet bloc exceeded $3 billion. The Soviets also wrote off a quarter of Syria's military debt. Assad's government included more communists, and Syria became a haven for exiled Iraqi communists. The alliance was now at its peak, both militarily and politically. Daesh, the Syrian communist leader, assured the KGB that his party would remain loyal to Moscow and ideologically orthodox. He told the 1980 Party Congress that true friendship meant supporting every Soviet foreign policy action. Daesh also benefited from Assad's crackdown on rival communists, with many jailed or forced into exile. The KGB provided the party with funds, training, and even arms, cementing a relationship of mutual dependence. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, the KGB funneled substantial sums to the Syrian Communist Party, both directly and through lucrative contracts with party-controlled companies. In 1980 alone, payments exceeded $329,000, with even larger sums coming from business ventures. The KGB also supplied the party with pistols and ammunition, carefully disguised in Syrian packaging to avoid detection. Despite KGB support, divisions within the Syrian Communist Party grew. Daesh, Agin, in poor health, struggled to maintain control. He became increasingly suspicious of his associate FAID, accusing him of corruption and plotting. By the mid-1980s, Dash's inability to adapt to Soviet reforms like glasnost and perestroika worried Moscow. He remained a staunch Stalinist, even as the Soviet Union changed around him. Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon led to one of the largest air battles of the 20th century between Israel and Syria. The Israeli Air Force destroyed Syrian missile sites and shot down numerous MiGs without loss. Both sides blamed each other for the defeat. Syrians cited Soviet equipment failures, while Soviets blamed Syrian incompetence. Yet both needed each other, Syria for arms and the Soviets to restore their reputation in the Arab world. Soviet intelligence officers like Vadim Kirpichenko painted a flattering picture of Assad for the Kremlin, describing him as calm, attentive, and wise. However, this image masked the brutal reality of Assad's regime, which during the early 1980s killed thousands of its own citizens and destroyed much of Hama, a center of opposition. The contrast between the sanitized reports and the regime's actions highlighted the complexities of Soviet alliances in the Middle East. Assad's regime became notorious for targeting enemies abroad, providing safe haven for terrorists, and carrying out its own assassinations. In 1981, a Syrian hit squad was caught in Jordan attempting to kill the prime minister. Other squads operated in Europe, and a bomb attack in Paris killed and injured dozens. Despite these actions, the Soviet Union continued to support Syria, seeing no better alternative for a Middle Eastern ally. Syria's quest for military parity with Israel led to ever-increasing dependence on Soviet arms and advisors. By the mid-1980s, the Syrian economy was collapsing under the weight of military spending, and Gorbachev was unwilling to provide further bailouts. Assad reluctantly accepted that strategic parity was unattainable, but still regarded the Soviet alliance as essential for Syria's security. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was mourned in Damascus as a greater loss than even in Moscow. People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, South Yemen, became the Soviet Union's closest ideological ally in the Arab world after its independence from Britain in 1970. The ruling National Liberation Front declared itself Marxist-Leninist, and Soviet naval forces made increasing use of Yemeni ports. However, Soviet attempts to impose a command economy led to inefficiency and shortages, such as the disappearance of fish after collectivization. South Yemen was plagued by internal power struggles, with pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions vying for control. In 1978, a Soviet-backed coup installed Abd al-Fattah Ismail as leader, but the regime remained unstable. The Soviets provided intelligence training and equipment, but their Yemeni allies were often seen as unreliable and demanding, seeking ever more aid and infrastructure from Moscow. From 1972, the KGB maintained close ties with South Yemen's intelligence service, providing free training and ciphers. Joint operations targeted the US, UK, and Saudi Arabia, including bugging embassies. However, the Soviets often viewed their Yemeni counterparts with disdain, citing cases of personal misconduct and lack of ideological commitment among Yemeni officers. KGB's main concern in Yemen was the pro-Western North Yemen Arab Republic. After the YAR resumed relations with the US in 1972 and sought American arms, the Soviets launched active measures to discredit pro-American officials. Assassinations and coups followed, with the Soviets supporting their preferred candidates and denouncing alleged Saudi and American plots. Repeated coups and civil wars in both North and South Yemen frustrated Soviet ambitions. Despite propaganda and military support, the Soviets could not control the constant infighting. In 1986, a bloody civil war in South Yemen killed thousands, including many Soviet-trained officers. Even Fidel Castro reportedly asked the Yemeni delegation, "When are you people going to stop killing each other?" After decades of division and conflict, North and South Yemen finally unified in 1990, forming the Republic of Yemen. However, the new state remained unstable, and in 1994, northern forces launched an attack to bring the entire country under their control. The Soviet legacy in Yemen was one of both strategic influence and persistent instability. Initially, the Soviet Union hoped to make Israel an ally, supporting its creation in 1948 and sending arms via Czechoslovakia. Early Soviet agents infiltrated Israeli institutions, with some gaining access to high-level secrets. However, Soviet enthusiasm quickly turned to suspicion as Israel's ties with the US grew, and Zionism was officially condemned as an imperialist plot. The early 1950s, anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic paranoia gripped the Soviet security services. Jewish officials were purged, and conspiracy theories about Zionist plots abounded. Even after Stalin's death, Jews remained largely excluded from the KGB. Despite this, some Israeli politicians and officials did pass information to the Soviets, reinforcing Moscow's suspicions of Israel's Western ties. KGB managed to recruit several Israeli agents in the 1950s, including Ze'ev Avni, who worked for both Mossad and the Soviets, and Yisrael Beer, a military historian with access to top secrets. However, these successes were short-lived, as Israeli counterintelligence uncovered and arrested them. The KGB's inability to maintain high-level sources in Israel became evident during the Six-Day War, when they were caught completely off guard. Outbreak of the Six-Day War in 1967 stunned the KGB. Their embassy in Tel Aviv was unprepared, and the closure of diplomatic relations further hampered intelligence operations. The KGB tried to continue its work from the Russian Orthodox Church mission in Jerusalem, but with limited resources and under close surveillance, their effectiveness declined sharply. After the Six-Day War, Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union to Israel surged, with the KGB using this as an opportunity to plant agents. However, most émigrés failed to maintain contact with the KGB once abroad. The Soviet obsession with Zionist conspiracy led to harsh restrictions on immigration and persecution of refuseniks, fueling international criticism and further complicating Soviet-Israeli relations. KGB interpreted every protest by Soviet Jews as part of an international Zionist conspiracy. Reports to the Politburo detailed efforts to neutralize even minor protests, using tactics like dividing groups, compromising leaders, and isolating individuals. Soviet policy oscillated between deterring immigration and concern over international criticism, leading to inconsistent and often contradictory actions. In 1972, the Soviet Union introduced a diploma tax on Jewish emigrants with higher education, sparking international outrage. Brezhnev and Andropov debated how to handle the backlash, with Brezhnev even suggesting creating a Jewish theater as a distraction. The confusion and self-pity in Soviet leadership discussions reflected the broader incoherence of their policy toward Jewish emigration and Zionism. KGB redeemed itself in 1973 by providing advance warning of the Yom Kippur War, likely thanks to penetrations in Egyptian intelligence. However, they failed to achieve similar success in infiltrating the Israeli Defense Force. Most Jewish émigré agents lost contact with the KGB, and Soviet efforts to place moles in sensitive Western positions met with little success. In the 1970s, the KGB sent a series of illegals, agents with false identities, into Israel to contact existing agents and recruit new ones. However, these operations were plagued by betrayals and counterintelligence successes by Shin Bet. The arrest of illegal resident Yuri Linov in 1973 led to the cancellation of further illegal missions and highlighted the difficulties of operating in Israel. After Linov's arrest, the KGB negotiated with Israeli intelligence for his release, eventually agreeing to a swap involving Jewish prisoners and a Bulgarian Jew. The secrecy surrounding the exchange reflected the sensitivity of such operations and the desire to avoid public perceptions of trading spies for persecuted Jews. In response to US pressure linking trade to immigration policy, the Soviet Union sharply reduced the number of exit visas for Jews in the mid-1970s. Andropov took a personal interest in monitoring and restricting Jewish immigration, even intervening in minor issues like the import of Passover matzos. The KGB also worked to prevent international phone calls by Jewish nationalists, viewing them as a threat to state security. Despite massive efforts, the KGB's operations in Israel and among Jewish immigrants yielded little strategic intelligence. Most agents lost contact or proved unreliable, and the KGB's inability to penetrate Israeli intelligence was acknowledged even by East German counterparts. The focus shifted to monitoring immigrant activities and suppressing dissent at home. KGB's legacy in the Middle East is one of deep involvement, complex alliances, and frequent disappointment. In Syria, Yemen, and Israel, Soviet intelligence operations shaped political developments but often failed to achieve lasting strategic goals. The collapse of the Soviet Union left its former allies struggling with instability, economic hardship, and unresolved conflicts. Throughout the Cold War, ideology and espionage were tightly intertwined in Soviet foreign policy. The KGB's efforts to support communist parties, infiltrate governments, and manipulate regional politics were driven by both strategic interests and a belief in the global struggle between socialism and capitalism. Yet, the realities on the ground often undermined these ambitions, as local actors pursued their own agendas. History of KGB operations in the Middle East offers important lessons about the limits of foreign influence, the dangers of ideological rigidity, and the unpredictable consequences of covert action. While the Soviets achieved some tactical successes, their inability to adapt to local realities and internal divisions among their allies often led to failure. The legacy of these operations continues to shape the region today. As we look back on the era of KGB espionage in the Middle East, the shadows of secret operations, shifting alliances, and ideological battles still linger. The stories of Syria, Yemen, and Israel reveal the complexity of Cold War politics and the enduring impact of intelligence operations on the modern world. Understanding this history is essential for making sense of today's geopolitical challenges.